And now it is my great pleasure to introduce you to our speaker. Tommy Hyde is a Burlington, Vermont based documentary filmmaker. Underdog, a film 10 years in the making, is his directorial debut. Following a limited theatrical run across the country, Tommy and the Underdog team toured the film around Vermont communities in partnership with organizations such as Vermont Public, Farm First, and now Vermont Humanities, in an effort to add Doug's voice to the conversation around rural mental health. So, I'm going to tee right up because this is a question I'm sure you hear all the time,
Let's
which is
go.
how? How did you find Doug, and um, how did you come to this wonderful film?
It was pure blind luck. I wasn't the first person to stumble across the farm on Munger Street, and I sure wasn't the last. But I went to college just up the road from where Doug had his farm, and I took this class my first year called Adventure Writing and Digital Storytelling, where you went out into the local community and you wrote a little paper and made a little video about someone who was interesting. And my professor told me about this guy who was a dairy farmer in the outskirts of town who had, a bunch of cows. And he said like 5 or 6 sled dogs. So I went out there with a friend and Doug, we had cameras and we got out of the car and Doug had no idea who we were. And yet he waved us along as like, come on, let's go. And within about 30 minutes, he had us covered head to toe in cow shit. And I think we were there for like 4 or 5 hours, which is like a lifetime in the day of a dairy farmer. And Doug thought he had sort of scared us off. But we, on the way back to school, we stopped at the local agway. And just to show you how ignorant I was about farming life at the time, I asked if we could get some of those farmer jumpsuits. I would only later learn that they're called coveralls. But we came back and to Doug's credit, he said that was the day he knew he could trust us. And that sort of began this, 5 or 6 year filming process. I heard on day one about Doug's dream to go to Alaska, but it took me much longer to learn that he'd never left the farm for more than a few days his whole life. And in any good story, you have tension, and that felt like there was a lot of tension there. And so I pitched Doug in the idea of making a film. It was my dream to make a documentary. It was his dream to go to Alaska, and we decided to do it. And that the film you see is a result of that initial sort of pact, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that trust really shown in the film itself, because just kind of like some of those intimate times you get in the film with Doug and with you behind the scenes there, it's really telling of just kind of like the trust and the care that you two had for each other. So I just wanted to say thank you for showing that, knowing that he's no longer with us. And this story is kind of living past his life here. But you mentioned this kind of right at the beginning too, is how long this process took. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about um, getting to know Doug in that 10-year span, and like how did you piece together what bits of the story you wanted to make a film?
I called Doug Professor Butler from the School of Hard Knocks. And and he taught me so much about farming and life, but he also really taught me how to make a film. For example, I thought I was supposed to sit someone down for an interview, but literally the only time, and anyone who's grown up in a deer hunting community will understand this, that I could get him to sit still was in the deer stand. And so that sort of naturally became the spot where he would go deep. And there's, parts of that audio from the deer stand that are kind of pulled and pressed into different areas of the film. And so it was like Doug was this crazy constraint, and like constraints create creative solutions. Like you see Doug doing the same thing on the farm. He has all sorts of constraints and he gets very creative making it work. And so Doug in and of himself was a constraint. And then I'd never really held a camera before I knew him. So I didn't know, if what I was doing was right or wrong, but I was just doing it. And so there was a lot of footage that got sort of uh, never even saw the light of day because it was just really bad. Took me like 3 years to pretty much be able to produce anything that was more or less usable. But the cool side effect of that was by that time I had sort of blended into the wallpaper. And so they were just, Doug and his family just used to having me around and used to a camera being around. And I think that's, part of where some of those little nuggets of real sort of peek through. I rambled a little bit. I'm not quite sure if I answered your question, Jacob.
No, that was great.
Um,
Thank you.
Somebody is asking, how was the filmmaking process funded? I'm sure that's a big thing. Is how do you fund such a project, particularly since it took a long time and you went to Alaska amongst other places?
It's a really good question, and I'm really proud that the film was mostly funded within Addison County. We partnered with the Town Hall Theater, if anyone's familiar with that awesome arts organization. And Doug Anderson, who was the director, was like one of the first people. I had like a title and like a short paragraph just describing what the film was. I didn't have any, experience to speak of, but I told him about this project and he said, you know what, like, let's help you do it. So mostly funded locally. And what's interesting about the documentary filmmaking process, especially the sort of bootstrapped indie documentary filmmaking process, is you're kind of doing all aspects of the filmmaking process at the same time. So while I was fundraising, I was, and with a bunch of help from other people as well, filming and editing and working on music and thinking about distribution. And it's kind of fun when all those things can happen at the same time. It's a little bit overwhelming, but it also allows for, them to sort of be in dialogue a little bit with each other. So, the filming affects the edit affects the music, maybe we use that in a fundraising pitch. So I learned a lot. But certainly if anyone out there has ideas on how to fundraise more easily than that, let me know. It's like what every documentary filmmaker spends all their time trying to raise money, and then like 10% of it is like actually trying to make the damn thing.
Yeah, fundraising is always a challenge. So, like Tommy said, support your small arts organizations and local businesses, right? And kind of related to that note on kind of finances and whatnot, it was really interesting to see how your film echoed a lot of kind of like the modern problems Vermont is facing with housing and economics, and healthcare. And so I was wondering, did you kind of want to talk about those issues through the film at the onset, or is that more just a product of the story you were putting together?
It's a good question. It really was a product of the story, and the story from day one was always Doug. Like the film, I think succeeds because he is such a good character. He is so compelling. And so you kind of go into any film project. I didn't know this at the beginning, but you kind of have ideas of themes and threads. And I knew there were some financial troubles on the farm. I knew that Doug had some trouble with his lungs. I knew that, he was trying to fix the old farmhouse. Like I knew he had this dream. And so here are all these threads, and I'm trying to be aware of them and figure out, when does Doug have a doctor's appointment, or when is stuff happening that could be relevant to filling out one of these threads. And then you sort of take all this information, you find your sort of narrative backbone, which for Doug was this trip to Alaska, and then at the end you kind of write the script. You put all your scenes on index cards and rearrange them and make a 6-hour film, and then eventually you get it down to 80 minutes. So roundabout way of saying, had a sense of those themes, but certainly didn't realize that this film would be able to have an on-the-ground impact until we showed it for the first time in Middlebury. And Doug, the day after, started getting calls from other farmers in the community who had to sell their cows and didn't, quite know how to reckon with it. And that was just sort of the start of a realization that Doug's story was encouraging a conversation, conversations that Vermonters don't always have, that I don't always have. And again, that all comes back to like the strength that he had in, being vulnerable and then having the trust for that to be released, very, very publicly. So again, kudos to Doug.
Was it when you were saying earlier that, you guys came back the next day and he knew he could trust you? That's Doug, but there's other people in this film as well. And I wondered what it's like to become a part of the wallpaper, as you say, when there's like family dynamics happening. And is there a moment where you felt that kind of switched and you really could have the camera on when he's talking and looking at bills, or being, meeting with the bankruptcy lawyer? And, how did that feel, becoming that close to him as time went on?
It was really nice. I mean, I think halfway through the process, I learned about the concept of like journalistic distance, which is this idea that if you're a journalist, you need to maintain a certain amount of emotional space between you and the subject, so you can write something that's objective. I sort of came about it halfway, and I was like trying to explain it to Doug one day, and he was like, okay, but like, you got to help me like pull this calf out. It's stuck. Like, put the goddamn camera down. And like, as soon as that happened, I was like, what am I talking about? Like, that doesn't feel right to me. Like, I'm also not quite a journalist. Like, I'm a filmmaker. And so I just sort of leaned into it. I was like, Doug's my friend. He's going to become a better friend. His family, as an extension, became extensions of my family. You don't quite see it in the film. You almost see like the like skeleton of it, but that farmhouse and that place, I mean, I think you see some of the photos of what it kind of looked like in the opening credit sequence, but very welcoming space. Everyone from the neighborhood was welcome. It was a spot where all the cousins came back to every single year. And it was a spot that, when it was in dire straits, Doug bought from his parents and allowed them to sort of retire. And they actually went to Hawaii every winter. Doug, that feeling of that welcoming feeling was so meaningful to Doug that he took it upon himself to shoulder all that burden. And I felt very much, even though things looked a little different and it was a little bit emptier than it had been in the past, it sort of felt like I was just another person on this, timeline of, there are so many people who have actually met at various screenings over the past year or so, who have a story about the farm on Munger Street and the Butlers and being welcomed in. And it's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, I would just echo that, even just kind of with the promotion of tonight's event and kind of seeing all the little connections that were coming out through the emails and questions that were coming through before the event. So the impact of that family is definitely there. And one of the questions we got in kind of echoes what you were talking about there, asking, and kind of like, in what you've seen, what are some of the bigger needs that you see farmers have in healthcare and mental health, and how can we support them or advocate for them in those spaces?
It's a really good question. And I think it's funny. You make a film and then most people assume that I'm like an expert in farming now, or like I'm an expert in mental health, or I'm really none of those things. I'm actually just like a Doug expert. But what's been cool has been partnering with organizations who are actually doing the work in the communities. And the one I think about first is like Farm First is a really amazing program. If folks aren't familiar with them, they take this peer-to-peer model, which is proving to be very effective, where farmers who are in need of pretty much anything, they have a main line, and farmers can call and get connected to another farmer. And whether it be, a financial struggle, a feeling that they're dealing with issues of passing the farm off to the next generation, legal representation, the farmer on the other line can, be as little as, someone to talk to, and as much as someone who can help sort of plug them into a continuum of resources. And so my piece in advocating for farmers has been to really plug that work. But I also think there's a lot that you can do just as like a neighbor. I think that's one of the really beautiful things that Gather, the partner book to this film shows, is that sometimes it's those really small casual interactions that can make a world of difference. So we all live in farm communities, even the person who's in from New Zealand. There's a whole lot of farmers down there. And like, I don't know, I, at least for my part, have tried to think of myself as like a part of the community, and realize that like I'm a consumer of these products. And so I can put a little bit more energy towards giving something back. And, for Doug, it was just presence and a listening ear. Yeah.
A question that just came in that said, did Doug talk about the challenges of his parents? And am I remembering right, his grandparents, who would have had to make significant changes around 1958 when milk cans gave away to bulk tanks, or back in the Depression of the 1930s? Did he ever talk about that with you? There's a little of that, I think, in the film, but question from one of our people online.
Yeah, I'll do the best I can, because it sounds like this question asker probably has a better sense of the history than I do. But I mean, Doug would talk about his grandparents as people who, like, he didn't really think he did hard work. He thought his grandparents really had to do hard work. They were the ones who, came over in horse and covered wagon from Rocky Ford, Colorado, and settled in Little Ireland, Starksboro, which is where his parents, as he said, he really should be here explaining this, got to sneaking through the woods. And that's how he came about. And his folks, his parents, I think that it seemed like they made some bad bets. But in a time where there were a lot of snake oil salesmen, I think Buster, who's in the call, helped remind me of those like big blue silos, which were getting sold around. I've heard them called recently, I didn't know this at the time, Blue Death, because they were just like a really bad investment. They tried to grow at a certain point and things didn't really work out. They also tried to like develop some land, and that all collapsed. They like, just a couple things kind of went south. They tried to buy the land next door, then someone with more money in town swept in and bought the land, and really through no fault of their own, though. I mean, I think what's nice to see in the film is that like Doug is so clearly so bright, and he was so well respected as a cattleman in the state, and he's the last farm on Munger Street. There used to be 13 farms on Munger Street, but even he, can't make it work. So even if someone that resourceful, someone that intelligent can't make it to work, you got to realize that there is a contextual, a structural problem here.
So I'm gonna switch gears for a little bit and ask a question about one of the other key characters in the film, which are the dogs.
Yeah.
Um, and kind of going into it with the title Underdog, you're like, oh, the dogs are going to be kind of front and center, but it's a few minutes before you actually meet them, and I love that panning shot you do of kind of them all right before feeding time. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit as like how did you capture the characters of the dogs in the film, and what was the filming process with animals like?
Well, it was super fun. I'm a dog lover. I grew up with dogs, and there was probably, I think it was maybe a year before Doug actually knew my name. He always called me Wildman. And I tested him a few times and I was like, oh my God, Doug doesn't actually know my real name. And yet he has 600 cows. He knew that he had names for most of those. And I think honestly, between you, me, and the fence post, he had 90 dogs when I first met him. I think he paid taxes on about 50 of
That's
them.
incredible. Wow.
And
The amount of food too for those.
it's an outrageous amount of food. Uh, so it was cool, and there was always this tension in the edit. Me and my producing partner Aaron always had this conversation about the push and pull of the dogs and the cows, like these two animals that represented very different parts of Doug's life and Doug's experience. And we thought a lot in the process of editing how to sort of play them off each other and show the tension that they represented, while also, like, I don't know, you can't help but see how much Doug loves all of them. It's not like there was one or the other, but they just sort of represented these different things. And I had favorites. Princey is a dog you end up seeing a lot, just because she was on my side of the truck when we drove to Alaska, and so I would always take her out to pee, and she was a really good cuddler. She had these really pretty eyes. I miss her today. And yeah, so I started forming my own relationships with the dogs as well, which was very, very fun. One thing Doug helped me do when we were in Alaska together is actually get behind a sled and race, not actually in a race, but we just sort of did a little practice with 8 dogs. And it was very sweet and very funny because they wouldn't really start running until I started singing, which you see Doug do all throughout the film. And then when I started singing and hooting and hollering, they were like, all right, everything's normal. We can, run and keep pace. But it was a very sweet experience. And I tried to capture it in the film. I think it could have been captured better, but there is a very trusting relationship, going back to trust between the dogs and the musher. Like the team is very in tune with each other, and Doug is very in tune with the team, and that relationship like really starts to shine when everyone's working in tandem.
So when I was watching the film and I saw the truck get loaded up with all the dogs, and I just couldn't imagine that this truck was going to make it to Alaska. And I would love to
Right.
know just briefly what that road trip was like, because Doug emanates such joy and openness, it seems, at least on camera. Even in what felt like dark times, he just always had a joke. And I would assume that any place you stopped, the dogs would be of interest, but
Yep.
he would have been like the most exciting thing to maybe come through a lot of towns. So what was that like to make that trip and then to see him get to experience his lifelong dream?
It was such a joy. I mean, it was also simultaneously so overwhelming. It took us 10 days to get from Middlebury to Fairbanks, 100 hours of driving. And I think there's a shot of us stopping at like the rest stop right outside O'Hare. And we walked in, and there are planes flying overhead. People are just gawking, taking photos. And we walk in, and the person who's behind the cash register serving us coffee is like, "Where are you boys going?" And we tell her we're going to Fairbanks, and she just shakes her head and goes, "You poor things, the coffees are on me." And that started a string of free coffee. We get to South Dakota again. you poor things, coffee's on me. At one point in the trip, actually 3 times in the trip, we got the cops called on us because I don't know, big truck, bunch of dogs, people didn't know what was going on. I think my favorite line from one of those police officers, they came around back and said, I got a call about some suspicious activity, but this doesn't look suspicious. This just looks fun. And that officer spent like 20 minutes with us, like hanging out with the dogs and talking with Doug. They refused a beer from Doug at the time. And then like slowly but surely, it got less weird for people to see us. We were less of a spectacle until we arrived in Alaska, and the Alaskan Border Patrol agent, like maybe I've just gone through the border here too much, but like was one of the happiest, go luckiest people of all time. And, was like, welcome to the land of dog mushing. And you see in the film, like how meaningful it is for Doug to finally make it. And, the happiest moments were when he would see some sort of wildlife. Caribou was a big one. Moose was a big one. Buffalo, another big one. And I remember also just being struck with like how quiet he got when we were going through the Rockies. Cause I think there was an element of joy and excitement in the trip, but there was also an element of this was really his first time away from home. And, if anyone remembers their first time away from home, it's also that. It's also scary and overwhelming. And so to see someone who's so at home and so capable, on the homestead in Vermont, out of their element, was a little unnerving to me. It's like sort of like watching your hero, slip or something. They like seem human all of a sudden. But that, I don't know, it just added to the whole experience.
And I've seen a lot of questions come in asking a little bit more if you could talk about what the production process was like. Like, how did you have any kind of strategies when you were editing? And did you collaborate with any other Vermont filmmakers kind of before and after the process?
Yeah, it's a good question. So more or less, after I got back from Alaska with Doug, I had this mountain of footage. I think it was about 300 hours of footage. And I didn't really know what to do with it. I knew something was in there, but I didn't quite know how to get it out. And so I pitched a filmmaker named Aaron, who I referenced earlier, who's a generation older than me and has made 13 documentary films on this idea. And I was living in LA at the time because I sort of thought, oh, you got to move to LA to make movies. Spoiler alert, you don't. And I pitched him on the idea, and he said, do you want to, move to the Adirondacks and work on it? And I said, that's exactly what I want to do. So I moved out. And he sort of helped me get a little space, combined with this mentorship, to figure out how to actually put a movie together. And it was interesting because as that was happening, we were cutting scenes and starting to put rough drafts together. That was when Doug's farm was starting to, go under, more or less. And so that was another moment where I was editing, but also filming. And the first scene you see in the film, it sort of comes back later. You see this sort of trailer and these cows leaving. That was all happening. And the bankruptcy lawyer scene, that was all happening while we were in the edit. And it was a pretty interesting experience from a filmmaking perspective, because I feel like I'd been with Doug long enough that I was starting to, like, in a strange way, kind of predict what was going to happen next. But I also was able to kind of edit in my mind while I was filming, which just made for like a way more efficient process. And it was a cool learning experience for me. And yeah, lots and lots of revision, a few test screenings, and just trying to stick to, what is the footage telling us this film wants to look like, and holding true to that was the biggest charge.
We have a few more questions relating to dogs, but also when when in the film, towards the end, when Doug is sort of moved away, obviously from dairy, and he's now gone to beef farming, and inviting the public to take rides on sled and everything. Like, how how did the dogs? Was he still mushing and doing all of that while trying to sort of keep the farm still up and going?
Yeah, he kept juggling till the bitter end.
Mm.
He you see the sale of the dairy herd. He started a small beef business. He also started working on a few other farms in the area. Um, and yeah, that there was this interest in the dogs. He always wanted to work a bit more with them, and so the tour company kind of sprang up. And then uh, there sort of started also this flywheel of college students. Like I sort of popped back after a couple years of editing, and there were just new sort of skinny jeaned New Yorker kids like out in the dog yard, like picking up poop and like helping Doug for no money. I was like, Doug, who are you? Who are you new college kids? Um, and they had seen obviously the same thing that I saw, like what a cool place to learn, so many of the things I'm not learning down the road. Um, and it was really cool. Some of those students were able to take Doug out to this other race in Wyoming called the Stage Stop Race, which is a little bit of a different format. I honestly wish I'd gone. It's like a stage race, so it's a little bit more in the mold of the Iditarod. It's a sprint race, so it's like 30, 40 miles every day, but they go to a different town. They race through the Tetons, and so Doug got to go to that. He came in second to last again and had the best time. So yeah, and very poetically, he passed. He went out to go feed his dogs one night, and he just didn't come back. So he was with him till the bitter end.
Oh, I know that's so hard is just kind of like thinking, and I know that I don't want to put words in your mouth, but just like having to kind of relive this experience with Doug and just again, thank you for sharing all these stories with him about him and kind of your experience. And I'm glad his legacy is living on like this. Um, and kind of another thing we've been dancing around a little bit is how a lot of the themes in the film and Doug's stories mirrors the story of Ian in the Vermont Reads book this year, Gather. And so I was wondering if you could just speak to a little bit about how you see these two artworks kind of relating to each other.
Yeah, we chatted a little bit about this before hopping on the call with everyone here, but it was really remarkable for me to read Gather because in some ways I felt like I was being brought inside of Doug's mind. Um, there are so many similarities in Ian and Doug's resourcefulness, also in their positive outlook on life. There's a moment in Underdog, which I really love, where Doug is in this sort of caving in barn, and he's talking about where the new calves will sit, and where they're going to pour a pad here, and might have a couple dogs over in the other barn over there, and then Gather, Ian's talking about putting that barn up where he knew it used to stand, and putting some cows in there. And it's a really beautiful outlook to have something to hold on to like that. And yeah, it's not all too often you can have a film and a book. There's oftentimes adaptations of a book to film, and something's always lost or in that translation. So it was cool to sort of see this alternate reality, and in some ways, like Ian is experiencing the next generation's difficulties. Um, you know, Doug's grandson Colton, who you also see in the film, he wins the ribbon with the calf. He is growing up, and he's farming, and he's growing up in the next sort of generation of struggles. So I thought a lot about Colton. So yeah, it felt a really beautiful continuation, but you also see this, this cultural continuation, this wisdom continue on down. The stories of being at deer camp, and the way how to fix a Honda carburetor, and like that. There's a wisdom in all of that, that I think is easily lost if it's not appreciated, and if it isn't supported. And yeah, I think it's I'm to be totally frank with everyone, I'm 3/4 of the way through the book, and I was considering skipping the call to finish the book. It's that good. But it's such a gift, and I would say it's like almost a must read for someone who's moving into the state.
Yeah, I'll echo that recommendation. Ken is a resident of Norwich, and we're very excited. And I just read that, yes, it is the most popular Vermont Reads book because it is for all readers. And it really does show what I said to someone, I get tired of the people romanticizing Vermont. I want people to read about Vermont and the people who populate this state. One question, someone asked, is Doug's family still on the farm?
So Doug's family, I got to call Casey here to get the latest update. But the last I heard, Casey was able to hold on to the farmstead. So that was a plot of land where the big white house is. And then also the place called Roosterville, which is that really beautiful plot that looks like it's, in the wilderness somewhere, where they deer hunt. It's actually within Middlebury town limits. They've managed to fight off every real estate developer you can imagine, keeping their deer hunting property sacred. So last I heard, Casey was there, but I know it's been a struggle to, because even though Doug has passed on, the issues remain. And there's a lot of meaning caught up in the land. This is another thing that Ian reckons with in Gather. It's more than just, a patch of dirt and rocks. There are souls and spirits and memories tied up in that place. So any decision is a very, very complicated one.
And we're kind of nearing the last end of our time here, so I'll just remind the chat, please. Feel free to put more questions in the Q&A or the chat. We appreciate all the ones that have come in today. And one thing I wanted to ask you, Tommy, as we're kind of reflecting on this film, or kind of like what's the next steps for this film, and what are ways people can support it? Are there any other screenings kind of lined up as well?
Yeah, it's a great question. The best resource to learn about the film is the website. It's underdogfilm.org. And we've really been enjoying the community screenings that we've been able to program with folks. It's been a platform for various nonprofits and groups to fundraise and build community and create connections. It's also just been fun programming for town halls and granges across the North Country. So if that sort of thing interests anyone, definitely reach out to me. I can put my email in the chat, and we can work together to come up with a screening. The film's also available digitally if you're looking for a more casual watch, or if you have a friend who you think might like the film, definitely send them a link. That's also available right on the website. And then it sounds kind of crazy, but reviews actually help. I'm sure all of us, use Google reviews now to navigate to, what's the best cappuccino in Londonderry. I don't know. I'm going to go on Google and check it out. So if anyone's familiar with Letterboxd or IMDb or Rotten Tomatoes, pick one. If you like the film, put on your best critic's hat and write something. If you didn't like the film, forget I said that. But yeah, that's a nice sort of digital way to get the word out. But I used to joke that Doug Butler was the best publicist that beer could buy, because he really seeded the interest in the film. Everyone he met, he would say, you know, they're making a movie about me. They're going to send me to Hollywood. And Doug was like, yeah, people really think they'd laugh and they'd say, yeah, but I think they think I'm full of shit. And I'm happy to report, you know, probably the most beautiful capstone to this whole project was the film was able to have a theatrical opening in Los Angeles, my triumphant return. And it's a really rare thing for a small project from a small town to have that sort of release. And Doug came out and we took him to the Hollywood sign. We took him to the Walk of Fame. When we were on the plane and we landed, I don't know how this happened because you can't get into cockpits of planes anymore. But the pilot was like, we just wanted to welcome you to LA and welcome our own movie star, Doug Butler, who's in town for the debut of his film Underdog. Like he had talked to enough people on the flight that word had gotten up to the pilot. And we land and Doug's on the radio. And he went surfing and we got to see the Hollywood sign. So it was like just a really special experience for Doug to be able to see on Santa Monica Boulevard, which if there's any place in the world that is complete opposite of Munger Street, it's Santa Monica Boulevard. People who had no frame of reference, you know, laughing and crying, you know, just as much as folks in audiences in Vermont were. And so that's, you know, that's been our big takeaway is like Doug's story might seem like a small story from a small space. I'd say Gather is very similar, but these are human themes. These are universal themes. These are resilient characters. And in a time when we're all, I mean, I at least am feeling a little lonely and, you know, wary of forces beyond control, I think Doug offers a pathway, you know, and one that's, yeah, just filled with grit and joy. And like, I guess, what else do you need?
And we can't end without asking, what are you working on now?
Oh, it's the
Just
big
some
question.
projects.
I've started to just say that my work moves with glacial majesty. This was a 10-year project. The next one is a 10-year project. Aaron, the guy I mentioned earlier, my producing partner, he's been working on a very different series about a Mexican national serving a life sentence in the Iowa State penitentiary system. Very different life circumstance, but a similar like sort of positivism and resilience in that character. And then I'm starting a music documentary as well, which I'm excited about because music was kind of sneaky my favorite part of this film process, being able to find music and write music with friends. And the soundtrack was really exciting. So the idea of like working on a film that's mostly music really excites me. And then I sort of have this other back pocket film that I want to explore that I mostly just have the title for, but it's called, and are you ready for it? A Beer Drinker's Guide to the North Country. And it's inspired in part by Doug, and I think, you know, folks will recognize this capacity, but Doug's incredible capacity to have a million things on his to-do list and yet be able to stop and shoot the breeze with anyone he sees for a pretty much an unlimited amount of time. And so I'm imagining this sort of traveling portrait through the North Country, like from Minnesota on to New York and Vermont up into Maine, of you know, folks who probably need to get something done at work, but are just shooting the breeze and having a beer and catching up. So yeah, that's the completely half-baked idea, but so is this film. So who knows?
No worries at all. We had one question come in at the end here, um, with someone whose son is now a dog sled musher, and they
Oh,
were
wow.
wondering if you knew the story of what initially inspired Doug to want to mush dogs and get involved with that. I don't think we actually
So
talked about that.
yeah. According to Doug, he I think he was coming home from a cattle auction and he was driving through Shelburne of all places, and there was a
Hmm.
dog race in Shelburne. There used to be like a whole New England circuit back when we got more snow. And there were races up in Lake Placid. I guess there were races in Shelburne. I think there still is a race in Vermont in Moortown, I want to say, every winter. But anyways, he passed a race. He thought it was super cool. And he looked into the classifieds and saw an ad for a 5-dog team. So he bought the 5-dog team. And they started racing, training the dogs on a trail around the farm. And, then his brothers got into it, his sons got into it. They grew the team. At one point they had 2 full teams going out and racing. And it became sort of a family thing. And Doug just kept doing it. And the dream was always, he would go in from milking every March with a little radio, and he would listen to the Open North American Championships in Fairbanks, from that first year onwards. And he would always say, like, I'm going to go race there. 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 And he eventually he did.
He did. I think that's a great spot to end us. Follow your dreams, folks. It's like we need the dreamers out there.
Yeah.
I just want to say thank you again, Tommy, for your time with us this evening and for touring this film as a part of our Vermont Reads programming. And we really appreciate you getting the story out there. And as we see in the chat, everyone's really resonated with it. So I hope the film continues to see this much praise.
Well, I'm bummed to not, be able to see everyone, but I'm constantly humbled and amazed that there's, groups of people who are gathering to watch this project. It's truly humbling and appreciated. And yeah, I don't know. I hope Doug's message resonates, and yeah, please share it. We could all use a little bit more Doug joy in our life.
For sure. All right, everyone. Thank you all, and we hope to see you at our next program. Have a good night.
Thanks, everybody.
y'all.
Good night.